Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Today we're diving into a story so extreme it feels like a typo in a history book. We're talking about a grudge, a conflict, a siege that lasted so long it became a multi-generational epic of blood, stone, and obsession. What's the longest you've ever waited for something? A package in the mail, a new season of a show. How about holding out in a city under constant attack for 21 years? That's not a typo. 21 years. Children born on the first day of the siege were legal adults by the time it ended. A soldier who was a fresh-faced 20-year-old when the first cannon fired would be a grizzled 41-year-old veteran by the last, assuming he even survived. This is the story of the Siege of Candia, the longest siege in recorded history. It's a story of how a single city, a fortress jewel on the island of Crete, became the focal point for a titanic struggle between two of the 17th century's great superpowers, the fabulously wealthy, ruthlessly pragmatic Republic of Venice, and the colossal, terrifyingly powerful Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just a fight over one city. It was the place where the medieval world, with its knights and its crusading rhetoric, came to die, and the modern world of industrial-scale warfare, of engineering, and of grinding, anonymous slaughter was born in fire and fury. So how did this happen? How could one city hold out for 2 decades against one of the most powerful military machines on Earth? And what, after 21 years of hell, finally brought its walls crashing down? To understand that, we first need to understand the two heavyweights stepping into the ring. In one corner, we have the Republic of Venice. Now, if you visit Venice today, you see a gorgeous, sinking city of canals, gondolas, and overpriced coffee. It feels like a museum piece, a postcard from the past. But in the mid-17th century, you need to erase that image from your mind. Think of Venice less like a quaint city and more like a ruthless global corporation with its own army and navy. It was a predator state run by a council of oligarchs, merchants whose god was gold and whose holy book was a ledger. They called their state La Serenissima, the most serene republic, which is one of history's greatest pieces of ironic branding. There was nothing serene about it. Venice was a maritime empire built on a mountain of cash generated by a near-total monopoly on the spice and silk trade from the east. All the pepper, cloves, and nutmeg that spiced up the bland food of Europe's rich and powerful had to pass through Venetian hands, and they took a massive cut. Their empire wasn't a big blob on a map like France or Spain. It was a strategic network of naval bases, trading posts, and island colonies that formed a chain from Venice all the way to the Levant. They called it the Stato di Mare, the state of the sea. And the single most important link in that chain, the absolute crown jewel of their overseas empire, was the island of Crete. The Venetians didn't call it Crete. To them, it was the Kingdom of Candia, and its capital city, also named Candia, modern-day Heraklion, was their regional headquarters. Crete was Venice's cash cow and its unsinkable aircraft carrier, rolled into one. It produced sweet wine, olive oil, and sugar, all of which poured money into the Venetian treasury. But more importantly, its strategic location was second to none. Sitting right in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, it allowed the Venetian navy to control the shipping lanes, protect its trade convoys, and project power in every direction. Losing Crete would be like a modern superpower losing its entire carrier fleet in one go. It was unthinkable. So, Venice poured a fortune into defending it, especially its capital city. They had spent over a century turning Candia into what they believed was the single most advanced and impregnable fortress on the planet. But we'll get to that later. For now, just know that for Venice, holding onto Candia wasn't just a matter of profit or pride. It was a matter of survival. And in the other corner, the Ottoman Empire. If Venice was a lean, mean corporate predator, the Ottoman Empire was a continent-spanning behemoth. In 1645, the Ottoman Sultan was, without question, one of the most powerful men in the world. His empire stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to the shores of the Persian Gulf in the east, from the deserts of North Africa to the plains of Hungary. It was a sophisticated, multi-ethnic, multi-religious superpower, administered by a massive bureaucracy, and defended by an army that had, for centuries, been the terror of Christendom. At the heart of that army were the Janissaries, an elite slave infantry corps taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans, raised as devout Muslims, and forged into the most disciplined and ferocious soldiers of their age. When the Ottoman war machine fixed its gaze on you, you had a very, very big problem. And in the 1640s, that machine was under the absolute command of one man, Sultan Ibrahim. And this is where our story starts to get weird. Because Sultan Ibrahim was, to put it mildly, not playing with a full deck of cards. History remembers him as Ibrahim the Mad. He had spent most of his early life locked away in a part of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul known as the Caves, or the Cage. This was a gilded prison where potential heirs to the throne were kept in isolation to prevent them from starting civil wars. It was a brutal system. For decades, Ibrahim lived in constant terror that his reigning brother, the formidable and ruthless Sultan Murad IV, would order his execution, which was standard practice. When Murad died, and the palace officials came to the Caves to tell Ibrahim he was now the Sultan, he was so terrified it was a trick that he barricaded the door and refused to come out. They had to bring his mother and the corpse of his dead brother to the door just to convince him it was safe. Years of this psychological torment had left him deeply, deeply unstable. He was prone to fits of explosive rage, crippling paranoia, and bizarre obsessions that shocked even the jaded courtiers of Istanbul. He developed a mania for obese women, sending his agents across the empire to find the largest women they could for his harem. He became obsessed with amber, lining entire rooms of the palace with it and forbidding anyone else to touch it. He once flew into a rage and, according to a popular story, had his entire harem of nearly 300 women tied up in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait simply because he heard a rumor that one of them had been unfaithful. One survivor was reportedly picked up by a passing French ship. This was not a stable, rational leader. This was a man whose personal whims and petty grievances could have earth-shattering geopolitical consequences. And in the autumn of 1644, a group of pirates made the fatal mistake of personally offending Ibrahim the Mad. The pirates in question were the Knights of Malta. Now, these guys had a fascinating brand. They were the last remnants of the old crusading orders, a brotherhood of celibate noblemen who portrayed themselves as the holy defenders of Christianity against the Turks. In reality, they were state-sanctioned pirates, operating from their island fortress of Malta and getting rich by preying on Muslim shipping in the Mediterranean. It was a holy war, sure, but a very, very profitable one. In September of 1644, a squadron of 6 Maltese galleys spotted a prize they couldn't resist. A rich Ottoman convoy sailing from Alexandria to the capital, Istanbul. But this wasn't just any convoy. This was a VIP transport. On board was a collection of high-ranking figures, including the former chief black eunuch of the Sultan's harem, the Kisler Agha, who was on his way to a comfortable retirement in Egypt. This was one of the most powerful officials in the entire empire. Also with him were about 30 women from the Sultan's own harem on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And most fatefully, there was a young boy with them, whose identity is still debated by historians. Some sources claim he was one of Sultan Ibrahim's own infant sons. The Knights of Malta didn't care. They saw a fat, slow-moving target. After a fierce battle, they captured the lead galleon, killing the chief eunuch in the process. The loot was spectacular: jewels, silks, fine horses, and a fortune in gold coins. The knights were ecstatic, but they had a problem. They were a long way from their home base in Malta and their ships were damaged. They needed a friendly port to make repairs, and more importantly, to sell off their incredible haul of treasure and enslaved passengers. And so they made the single stupidest decision of their careers. They sailed for the south coast of Crete, a territory belonging to the Republic of Venice. The local Venetian officials in Crete were horrified. They knew exactly who the Ottomans were and knew better than to provoke them. But the Knights of Malta were fellow Christians, and the lure of all that pirate loot flowing into the local economy was too strong. They allowed the Knights to stay for a few weeks, resupply, and sell their goods before slipping away back to Malta. From Venice's perspective, they hadn't done anything wrong. They hadn't participated in the attack. They had just offered parking. When news of the raid and the Venetian connection reached Istanbul, Sultan Ibrahim didn't just get angry. He went nuclear. This wasn't a political calculation for him. This was a direct, personal, unforgivable insult. His people had been killed. His property had been stolen. His harem had been violated. And the Venetians, those arrogant, money-grubbing merchants, had helped the pirates get away with it. His rage was absolute. In his first outburst, he ordered the immediate execution of every single Christian living within the Ottoman Empire. His Grand Vizier, a man who actually understood how the world worked, just barely managed to talk him down from an act that would have caused a civilizational collapse, pointing out that it would destroy the empire's economy. Fine, Ibrahim conceded. He wouldn't kill them all. Instead, he would focus his entire wrath on the source of the insult, Venice. The Venetian ambassador in Istanbul, the Bailo, was summoned, screamed at, and thrown into chains. Venetian ships in Ottoman ports were seized. Ibrahim vowed to wipe the Republic of Venice off the map and tear down the bell tower of St. Mark's Basilica with his own hands. The diplomatic channels were slammed shut. The point of no return had been crossed. War was coming. The Venetians knew they were in trouble. They frantically sent envoys to Istanbul, protesting their innocence. They explained that they had no control over the Knights of Malta. It didn't matter. Ibrahim was beyond reason. He began to assemble a massive fleet and army. It was one of the largest amphibious forces the Mediterranean had ever seen. Over 400 ships, carrying 50,000 soldiers, including thousands of elite janissaries, and a huge train of siege artillery. The Venetians watched in terror, assuming the target was their home city. They prepared the lagoons for a desperate defense. But Ibrahim and his advisors were playing a smarter game. Why attack the head of the snake when you can seize its most valuable possession? The target wasn't Venice, it was Crete. On April 30th, 1645, the Ottoman Armada set sail from the Dardanelles. They feigned a course for Malta to keep the Christian powers guessing. But then, in late June, the massive fleet appeared off the western coast of Crete. The invasion had begun. The Venetian defenses on the island were not prepared for a Shawkanda campaign of this scale. They had believed their own propaganda that the Ottomans would never dare a full-scale invasion. They were wrong. The Ottoman troops landed and immediately found allies among the local Greek population. The Cretan Greeks were Orthodox Christians who had been living under the rule of their Catholic Venetian masters for over 400 years. They were treated as second-class citizens, heavily taxed and religiously oppressed. To many of them, the Ottomans, who had a long-standing policy of religious tolerance for their Christian subjects so long as they paid their taxes, looked like the lesser of two evils. With local support and overwhelming numbers, the Ottoman army rolled across the western part of the island. The city of Chania was besieged and fell in just under 2 months. A few months later, the city of Rethymno also fell. Within a year, the entire island of Crete, with all its farms, villages, and towns, was under Ottoman control, all except one place, the capital, the fortress, the city of Candia. And now we have to talk about the city itself, because Candia wasn't just any walled city. By 1648, it was arguably the single most formidable defensive fortress on the face of the earth. This was not some picturesque medieval castle with tall, thin walls and romantic towers. Those were obsolete. easily shattered by modern gunpowder artillery. Candia was something new, the absolute pinnacle of a military revolution in engineering known as the Trace Italian, or the Star Fort. Imagine a city surrounded by a set of massive, geometric, arrowhead-shaped bastions made of earth and faced with stone. These walls were incredibly thick, in some places over 150 feet thick at the base, and they were sloped at a low angle. This design was genius. Instead of presenting a flat, vertical target that a cannonball could shatter, it presented a low, angled surface that would cause most incoming shots to deflect harmlessly, like a ricochet. The pointed shape of the bastions meant that every inch of the wall was covered by interlocking fields of fire from the neighboring bastions. There were no blind spots. An attacker trying to scale the wall at any point would be hit by devastating fire from at least two directions, a defensive crossfire they called enfilade. In front of these massive walls was a deep, wide, dry moat. And in the middle of that moat were even more defensive structures. Triangular outer forts called ravelins, designed to break up an attacking force before it could even reach the main walls. It was a defense-in-depth system, a machine designed for one purpose: to kill anyone who tried to attack it. The fortifications of Candia were a masterpiece, a symphony of overlapping fields of fire, devious angles, and sheer, brute mass. This was the fortress that now stood alone, a Venetian island in the middle of a conquered Ottoman sea. In May of 1648, the Ottoman army, confident after its easy victories across the rest of the island, finally arrived before the walls of Candia. The commander, Ghazi Hussein Pasha, expected a relatively quick fight. He had a massive army flushed with victory. The defenders were isolated and outnumbered. He did what commanders had done for centuries. He threw his men at the walls. He ordered wave after wave of janissaries to charge across the open ground, scale the bastions, and take the city by storm. It was a bloodbath. The Venetian defenders, a mix of Italian professional soldiers, local militia, and hardened naval troops, were waiting for them. From behind the perfectly engineered ramparts, they unleashed hell. Venetian cannons, expertly sighted by master gunners, tore horrific gaps in the charging Ottoman ranks. Musketeers lining the walls poured volley after volley into the attackers. The few who reached the base of the walls were cut down in the crossfire from the bastions. The assaults failed, completely and utterly, with staggering casualties for the Ottomans. Ghazi Hussein Pasha, a smart and capable commander, quickly realized that trying to take Candia by direct assault was suicide. This was a different kind of war. This fortress could not be broken by sheer force. It would have to be strangled. He ordered his men to dig in for the long haul. They began constructing a massive network of trenches, ramparts, and fortified camps, creating a mirror-image city of their own that faced the Venetian walls. Inside Candia, the defenders stared out at the sprawling Ottoman camp. They had won the first round, spectacularly. They had proven that their fortress was every bit as strong as the engineers had promised. But as they looked at the endless sea of Ottoman tents, at the supply ships arriving in the harbor they no longer controlled, a grim realization dawned. They were cut off. They were surrounded. Their victory hadn't won them the war. It had just trapped them inside of it. The stage was set. The lines were drawn. The longest, most brutal siege in history was about to begin. And this brings us to a fascinating point of debate. Venice knew this was coming. They had watched Ibrahim build his fleet. They had a choice. They could have disavowed the Knights of Malta, maybe even handed over the captured commanders to the Sultan, and just maybe they could have avoided this war. Instead, they chose to double down and defend their colony, sparking a conflict that would bleed them for an entire generation. Was it unforgivable pride, a refusal to bow to a rival? Or was it the necessary, calculated defense of their sovereignty, knowing that any sign of weakness would just invite further aggression? It's a tough call. What would you have done? Let me know what you think in the comments. The initial adrenaline of a fight is a powerful thing. It sharpens the senses, dulls the pain, and makes heroes out of ordinary men. But adrenaline is a finite resource. It burns out. And what's left in its place is something far heavier, far more corrosive. The slow, grinding, day in, day out reality of a war that has no end in sight. After the first bloody assaults on Candia failed so spectacularly, that grim reality began to settle over both camps like a shroud of dust from the pounded ramparts. The war of shock and awe was over. The war of attrition had begun. For the Ottomans, this was a moment of profound frustration. Their camp, which had been a temporary military position, began to transform into something more permanent, more sinister. It became a sprawling, parallel city of its own, a dark mirror to the fortress it was trying to kill. Tents gave way to wooden huts, then to stone and mud brick structures. A whole ecosystem sprang up to support the 50,000-plus soldiers, blacksmiths, merchants, cooks, clerics, and all the hangers-on that follow a massive army. It was like a twisted suburb of Istanbul had been transplanted to Crete, a city built entirely on the foundation of a single, obsessive goal: to take Candia. But this city was a hungry beast. It needed to be fed. Tens of thousands of men and animals required mountains of food, water, and fodder every single day. Gunpowder, cannonballs, timber, tools, all of it had to be shipped in across a sea still contested by the agile Venetian navy, which waged a relentless guerrilla war against Ottoman supply lines. And then there was disease. In any pre-modern army, the biggest killer wasn't the enemy, it was sickness. Dysentery, typhus, malaria, they swept through the tightly packed Ottoman camp like wildfire, carrying off far more soldiers than the Venetian cannons ever could. And for the commanders, there was the constant, nagging pressure from the capital. Sultan Ibrahim and later his successors demanded a victory. They were pouring the empire's treasury into this one spot on the map, and for what? To watch their elite janissaries die of fever while staring at a wall they couldn't breach. The pressure was immense. Commanders were rotated out, disgraced, or even executed for their failure to produce results. The Ottoman camp became a pressure cooker of frustration, disease, and simmering political intrigue. Inside the walls of Candia, the atmosphere was different, but no less intense. Here, the pressure wasn't political, it was existential. They were living on a knife's edge, day after day, year after year. And the man tasked with keeping that edge sharp was a figure who would become a legend: the Venetian Captain General, Francesco Morosini. Morosini was the living embodiment of the Venetian Republic, pragmatic, stoic, utterly relentless, and seemingly immune to despair. He wasn't a dashing, romantic hero. He was a cold, calculating professional, a man whose entire existence became singularly focused on the defense of this one city. He had arrived in 1646, and for the next 2 decades, with a few short breaks, Candia would be his world. His letters back to the Venetian Senate are masterpieces of understated crisis management. He never panics. He just lays out the grim facts. We are low on gunpowder. The St. Andrew Bastion took 17 direct hits today. I need 500 more soldiers to replace the ones who died of the plague. He was the anchor, the immovable object against which the Ottoman irresistible force was crashing. Under his command, life in Candia fell into a terrifying rhythm. The day would begin and end with the thunder of the Ottoman siege cannons, a constant, gut-vibrating percussion that became the soundtrack to their lives. The lucky soldiers were on the ramparts, manning the cannons and muskets, actively fighting back. The unlucky ones were on permanent repair duty. As soon as an Ottoman cannonball gouged a chunk out of a bastion's wall, teams of laborers, soldiers and civilians alike, would be out there under fire, frantically trying to patch the damage with dirt, rubble, and timber before the next barrage hit. The food was rationed, growing more meager with each passing year. The water was precious. The city, once a bustling hub of Renaissance commerce and culture, was slowly being pulverized into a ruin. but still they held. The first few years of the siege were defined by a brutal but relatively conventional style of warfare. It was a deadly conversation held at a distance, spoken in the language of iron and gunpowder. The Ottomans would spend weeks, sometimes months, hauling their colossal siege cannons into position. These weren't the neat, mobile field guns of later centuries. These were monsters. Some were so large they had to be cast on site. They fired stone or iron balls that could weigh 500, 600, even 700 pounds. You wouldn't just hear a cannonball like this coming. You would feel its passage through the air, a deep, terrifying whoosh followed by a cataclysmic impact that could shake the very foundations of the earth. The goal of these bombards was simple: to pick one spot on Candia's massive bastions and just hammer it, day and night, relentlessly, until the stone facing cracked and the packed earth behind it began to crumble, creating a breach. But the Venetians were masters of artillery themselves. Their cannons were smaller, more numerous, and more accurate. Their gunners were some of the best in Europe. From their protected positions on the high ramparts, they engaged in what was called counter-battery fire. They weren't just shooting at the Ottoman soldiers. They were shooting at the Ottoman cannons. It became a lethal duel between gun crews. A Venetian gunner who spotted the telltale puff of smoke from a newly revealed Ottoman cannon had seconds to calculate the range and trajectory and fire back before his own position was targeted. It was a deadly art, and the survival of the fortress depended on it. When the artillery duel wasn't enough, the Venetians would turn to their other favorite tactic, the sortie. A sortie was essentially a calculated, high-risk raid. Under the cover of darkness or in the chaos of a storm, a select group of the best and bravest Venetian soldiers would burst out of a hidden gate in the fortress walls. Their objective was not to win a pitched battle. That was suicide. Their objectives were specific and surgical. They would sprint across the no-man's land between the fortress and the Ottoman lines, their goal the enemy's forwardmost trench or an exposed artillery battery. They would fall upon the unsuspecting Turks with swords, pistols, and grenades, create a moment of sheer chaos and terror, and then, most importantly, try to spike the enemy's cannons. This meant driving a large iron spike into the cannon's touch hole, the little hole where the fuse was lit. A successfully spiked cannon was useless until it could be taken back to a workshop for extensive repairs. After a few minutes of frantic, bloody work, the raiding party would retreat back to the safety of the walls, hopefully carrying fewer wounded than they had left with. These sorties were brutal, terrifying affairs. They were also absolutely necessary. They kept the Ottomans off balance, disrupted their siege works, and provided a massive psychological boost to the defenders. It was a way of screaming back at the faceless enemy, of proving they weren't just passively waiting to die. But sorties and artillery duels, no matter how successful, could not win the war. They could only prolong the stalemate. The Ottomans had a seemingly endless supply of men and cannons. The Venetians did not. For every Ottoman cannon they spiked, another would be brought up to replace it. For every Ottoman soldier they killed, 10 more seemed to arrive on the next supply ship. The grim arithmetic of the siege was working against Venice. And the Ottoman commanders, frustrated by their lack of progress on the surface, made a revolutionary decision. If they couldn't go over the walls, they would go under them. This is where the Siege of Candia transforms from a conventional, if brutal, siege into something else entirely. It becomes a descent into a new kind of hell, a three-dimensional war fought in darkness and silence, a conflict that would become the stuff of military legend. This was the beginning of the Great War of the Mines. The concept of mining in siege warfare wasn't entirely new. For centuries, armies had dug tunnels to try and collapse castle walls. But at Candia, the Ottomans elevated it to an industrial scale. It became their primary, obsessive strategy. They began to recruit specialist miners by the thousands, many of them from the mining regions of the Balkans in Serbia and Bosnia. men who had spent their entire lives working underground and understood the earth in a way a soldier never could. The process was agonizingly slow and incredibly dangerous. A team of miners would start from the safety of their own trenches, sometimes over 1,000 feet away from the Venetian walls. They would begin to dig a narrow tunnel, or gallery, just big enough for one man to crawl through. The work was done in near total darkness, with only the faint, flickering light of an oil lamp to see by. The air was foul, thick with the smell of sweat, dirt, and human waste. The digging was done with small pickaxes and shovels, the earth painstakingly passed back in leather bags down the line of crawling men. Progress was measured in feet per day. For the men in that tunnel, the dangers were constant. A miscalculation in the shoring timbers could lead to a sudden cave-in, burying them all alive in seconds. They could hit a pocket of unbreathable gas. Or worst of all, they could hear the one sound that every miner dreaded: the faint thump, thump, thump of an enemy pickaxe digging towards them from the other side. Because the Venetians, masters of engineering that they were, had not been idle. They understood the threat from below. As the Ottoman mining efforts ramped up, the Venetians began their own monumental feat of subterranean construction. They created a vast, permanent network of defensive tunnels deep within and in front of their own fortifications. These were not attack tunnels, they were listening galleries. Their purpose was intelligence. Imagine being a Venetian soldier assigned to listening duty. Your job is to sit for hours in a small, pitch-black chamber deep underground. The silence is absolute, so profound you can hear the blood pumping in your own ears. Your only job is to listen. You might press your ear directly to the wall or use a primitive stethoscope, a simple wooden rod, to feel for vibrations in the earth. Or you might place a drumhead on the ground with a few pebbles on top, watching to see if they tremble. You are listening for the telltale sound of Ottoman miners, the faint, rhythmic scratching and tapping that meant death was tunneling its way towards you. When a listening post detected an enemy tunnel, the underground war entered its next, terrifying phase. The Venetian engineers would quickly calculate the enemy's likely depth and direction. Then they would dispatch their own team of counterminers to dig an intercepting tunnel. This is where the true claustrophobic horror began. Sometimes, the two tunnels would break directly into each other. Suddenly, a wall of dirt would collapse, and you'd be face to face with your enemy in a crawl space no bigger than a coffin. The fighting that erupted in these spaces was some of the most savage and desperate of the entire war. There was no room for rifles or swords. It was a fight with pistols, knives, daggers, sharpened shovels, and bare hands. A frantic, scrambling brawl in the dark to kill or be killed. More often, however, the goal wasn't to fight in the tunnel, but to destroy it. Once the Venetian counterminers got close to the Ottoman gallery, close enough to clearly hear them working on the other side of the wall of earth, they would stop digging. They would carefully excavate a small chamber and then pack it with barrels of gunpowder. This was a countermine. They would run a long fuse back down their own tunnel and then get out as fast as they could. The resulting explosion was not designed to be spectacular on the surface. It was a contained, subterranean blast that would violently collapse the enemy's tunnel, snuffing out the miners inside in an instant, burying them in a tomb of their own making. For the Ottoman miners, it was the ultimate terror. One moment you're digging in the dark, the next, the world simply ceases to exist. This underground war of detection, interception, and extermination became a constant, nerve-shredding feature of the siege. It was a deadly, three-dimensional chess game played by engineers in total darkness, where the price of a single mistake was being buried alive. But the true purpose of the Ottoman mines wasn't just to kill other miners. Their ultimate goal was to reach the foundations of Candia's main bastions. If an Ottoman mine gallery reached its target undetected, the miners would excavate a much larger chamber directly beneath the massive wall. They would then pack this chamber with an enormous amount of gunpowder, sometimes thousands of pounds of it. When this grand mine was detonated, the effect was apocalyptic. There would be a low, deep rumble that would grow into a ground-shaking roar. And then, a section of the bastion, a massive wall of stone and earth weighing tens of thousands of tons, would be physically lifted into the air, seeming to hang there for a split second before collapsing back down into a mountain of rubble, dust, and mangled corpses. In an instant, the impregnable wall was gone, replaced by a smoking, cratered ramp of broken earth and stone. This was the breach, but the explosion was only the beginning. The moment the dust began to settle, the real fight would start. The Ottoman commanders had thousands of soldiers, often elite janissaries who had been held in reserve, poised and ready for this exact moment. As soon as the breach was created, they would let out a roar and charge forward, scrambling up the newly formed rubble slope, trying to pour into the city through the gap. On the other side, the Venetians would be in an equally frantic race. Morosini and his commanders would have had contingency plans, with troops designated to respond to a breach at a specific bastion. These soldiers would sprint through the ruined streets of Candia, rushing towards the gap to meet the Ottoman assault head-on. The fighting that took place in these breaches was the stuff of nightmares. It was a desperate, chaotic hand-to-hand struggle on a steep, unstable slope of shifting rubble, choked with smoke and dust. Men fought with muskets used as clubs, with swords, pikes, axes, and even rocks. It was a primal struggle to plug the hole, to hold the line at all costs. Often, the defenders would succeed, driving the Ottomans back out of the breach after hours of savage fighting. They would then work frantically to build a new makeshift wall, a barricade of rubble, furniture, dead bodies, anything they could find, before the next assault came. This became the defining, hellish rhythm of the Siege of Candia for year after bloody year. Weeks of silent, subterranean tension followed by a cataclysmic explosion and a few hours of the most intense, brutal combat imaginable. Then, if the defenders held, the cycle would begin all over again. The Ottomans would start a new mine, a few feet to the left or right of the last one. The Venetians would listen, and the whole grim, deadly dance would continue. By the 1660s, the ground in front of the main bastions of Candia was no longer solid earth. It was a honeycombed labyrinth of collapsed tunnels, craters, and forgotten graves, a testament to a war that had sunk deep into the bedrock of the island itself. The city still stood, but it was being eaten away, piece by piece, from below. And the question was no longer if the walls would fall, but when. A story this insane can't stay a secret for long. As the years crawled by, the Siege of Candia started to transcend its origins as a grudge match between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. It morphed into something else, a European-wide spectacle, a grand and terrible drama that captured the imagination of an entire continent. In an age before 24-hour news, the defense of Candia became the ultimate breaking news story, told through breathless pamphlets, dramatic woodcut illustrations, and the letters of soldiers that circulated through the royal courts and coffee houses of Paris, Vienna, and Rome. It was framed, especially by the Pope and Catholic monarchs, as the great struggle of the age. This wasn't just Venice's problem anymore. It was Christendom's last stand. Candia became a symbol, a lonely bastion holding back the tide of the Ottoman hordes, a 17th century battle of Thermopylae that just refused to end. And symbols are powerful things. They attract people who are hungry for glory, for redemption, or simply for a cause to believe in. And so they started to come. Trickling in at first, then in waves, volunteers from every corner of Christian Europe made the perilous journey to Crete. They were a motley crew. There were German princelings with their retinues of household knights, looking to make a name for themselves. There were Italian soldiers of fortune, professionals who followed the sound of the cannons the way a predator follows the scent of blood. There were pious noblemen who genuinely believed they were fighting a holy war. And there were cynical veterans who just wanted to test their skills against the legendary Janissaries. They brought with them fresh manpower, money, and new military ideas. But they also brought their own egos, their own national rivalries, and a dangerous ignorance of the unique grinding hell that was the Candia frontline. The most significant, and ultimately most disastrous, of these volunteer forces came from the kingdom that was rapidly becoming the new cultural and military arbiter of Europe, France. Under the young, ambitious, and fabulously wealthy King Louis XIV, the Sun King, France was obsessed with one thing above all else: la gloire, or glory. French noblemen were expected to prove their worth on the battlefield, and there was no more glorious or famous battlefield in the world at that moment than Candia. In 1669, after 20 years of siege, a massive French expeditionary force set sail for Crete. This wasn't just a few adventurous nobles. It was a serious military commitment of nearly 7,000 men, funded in part by the French crown itself. And at its head was a man who perfectly embodied the French ideal of the dashing, aristocratic warrior, François de Vendôme, the Duc de Beaufort. Beaufort was a rock star of the French aristocracy. He was handsome, charming, brave to the point of recklessness, and a veteran of France's internal wars known as the Fronde. He arrived at Candia with immense fanfare, brimming with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He and his fellow French commanders looked at the situation with fresh eyes and a sense of superiority. They saw the Venetian strategy, led by the grim, exhausted Francesco Morosini, as cautious, defensive, and frankly, a bit boring. All this digging and listening in the dark, this endless cycle of reacting to Ottoman moves, it lacked panache, it lacked gloire. The French weren't there to just help hold the line. They were there to win. They were there to break the siege, once and for all, in a single, decisive, glorious blow. Morosini and his veteran Venetian officers were deeply skeptical. They tried to explain the reality of the war to their new allies. They tried to describe the intricate, three-dimensional battlefield, the terrifying effectiveness of the Ottoman mines, and the sheer, grinding attrition that had chewed up a generation of soldiers. They advised caution. They advised learning the unique rules of this terrible game before trying to change them. The French, in essence, told them to hold their beer. Their plan was breathtaking in its audacity. They dismissed the Venetian preference for small, targeted sorties. Instead, they planned a grand sortie, a massive, all-out assault by the entire French contingent, supported by other European volunteers. The objective wasn't to just spike a few cannons. The objective was to smash through the Ottoman lines, roll up their trenches, destroy their main camp, and shatter the morale of the Ottoman army so completely that they would be forced to abandon the siege. It was a plan that could, if it worked, end the 21-year-old war in a single morning. On the 25th of June, 1669, the attack was launched. Under the cover of a pre-dawn darkness, the French forces, with the Duc de Beaufort at their head, stormed out of the Candia's gates. In the initial moments, it seemed like their aristocratic bravado might actually work. The sheer shock and ferocity of the French charge caught the Ottoman troops in the forward trenches completely by surprise. The French, fighting with a furious energy, overran the first and second lines of Ottoman defenses. They were a whirlwind of steel and gunpowder, and for a glorious hour, it looked like the biggest gamble of the war was about to pay off. But the Ottoman siege lines were not a brittle crust. They were a deep, complex, and resilient organism. As the French pushed deeper, their command structure began to break down in the smoke and chaos of the maze-like trenches. The attack lost its cohesion, devolving from a coordinated assault into a series of frantic, isolated skirmishes. And then disaster struck. In the heat of the battle, as the French fought their way through a section of the Ottoman camp, they stumbled upon a massive store of gunpowder, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of barrels intended for the Ottoman mines. A stray spark, a dropped torch, a random musket shot, no one knows for sure what ignited it. but in an instant the entire magazine went up in a single, earth-shattering explosion. The blast was beyond catastrophic. It was a man-made volcano, an instantaneous inferno that vaporized everything and everyone in its immediate vicinity. Hundreds of the best and bravest French soldiers who had been leading the charge simply ceased to exist. The shockwave and the rain of fire and debris shredded the formations behind them. The Duc de Beaufort, the glamorous leader of the expedition, was caught in the heart of the explosion. His body was never definitively identified. The glorious assault instantly collapsed into a panicked, desperate rout. The surviving French soldiers, deafened, burned, and utterly demoralized, scrambled to get back to the safety of Candia's walls, harried every step of the way by the recovering and now furious Ottoman troops. The grand sortie, the stroke of genius that was meant to win the war, had failed in the most spectacular and bloody way imaginable. It was a devastating blow, not just to the manpower of the defense, but to its very soul. The hope that had arrived with the French fleet had been incinerated in a flash. The grim, attritional reality that Morosini understood so well had reasserted itself with brutal finality. And on the other side of the lines, the man in charge of the Ottoman effort was watching, learning, and preparing to tighten the screws. Because by 1669, the Ottoman war effort was no longer being run by the whim of a mad sultan. It was in the hands of a new kind of leader, a man who represented the absolute peak of Ottoman professionalism and ruthless efficiency. The endless, costly failure at Candia had become a deep stain on the prestige of the empire. Sultans had come and gone. Ibrahim the Mad had been deposed and strangled years ago. The empire itself had been teetering on the brink of collapse due to political infighting and corruption. Its salvation came from an unlikely source, an Albanian family known as the Coprulus. The Coprulus were a dynasty of grand viziers. Think of them as prime ministers with near-absolute power, who, through sheer force of will and brilliant administration, rescued the Ottoman state from itself. The first Coprulu named Pasha was an old, iron-fisted traditionalist who stabilized the government through a series of ruthless purges. But his son, who inherited the position in 1661, was the real genius. His name was Fazil Ahmed Pasha. Fazil Ahmed Pasha was everything Sultan Ibrahim was not. He was cool, methodical, patient, highly intelligent, and utterly implacable. He was a statesman, a logistician, and a general all rolled into one. He represented the Ottoman system at its most effective, a meritocratic machine that could bring overwhelming resources and meticulous planning to bear on any problem. And in 1666, he decided that the festering wound of Candia had been left open for long enough. He arrived at the siege camp in person, not just to command, but to finish the job. When Fazil Ahmed Pasha took charge, he completely revolutionized the Ottoman approach. He looked at the decades of failed, costly human wave assaults and the random, often unsuccessful mining operations, and saw a massive waste of resources. His approach was different. It was cold, mathematical, and terrifyingly systematic. First, he brought the full administrative genius of the Ottoman state to bear. He reorganized the supply lines, ensuring a constant, uninterrupted flow of food, weapons, and most importantly, gunpowder and fresh troops to the front. He stamped out the corruption and inefficiency in the camp. The Ottoman army at Candia was retuned into a finely honed, single-purpose weapon under his direct control. Second, he changed the way the Ottomans fought on the surface. No more reckless, bloody charges across open ground. He implemented, on a massive scale, a new technique of siegecraft, the systematic use of approach trenches. These were not the simple ditches of the past. Under Coprulu's direction, his engineers began digging a vast, complex network of trenches in a zigzag pattern, like a slow-motion lightning bolt crawling across the landscape towards the Venetian walls. The genius of the zigzag was that it meant the trench was never exposed to a direct line of fire, or enfilade, from the defenders' bastions. His soldiers could dig and advance in relative safety, getting closer and closer to the base of the walls without suffering the horrific casualties of a frontal assault. Day by day, week by week, the Ottoman trench system crept forward like an unstoppable tide of earth, choking the space around the fortress. Finally, and most importantly, Koprulu brought a new intensity and focus to the underground war. He ordered a non-stop, 24/7 effort. He set up a competitive system between his different mining units, offering huge bonuses for the first team to successfully breach a specific bastion. He focused his entire effort on just one or two key sections of the wall at a time, particularly the battered St. Andrew and Panigra bastions. Instead of trying to attack the whole fortress, he would pour all his resources into grinding one single point down to dust. The pressure on the defenders, which had been immense for 20 years, was suddenly ratcheted up to a level that was almost unbearable. The final, most brutal phase of the siege was about to begin, orchestrated by a man who treated warfare not as a gamble for glory, but as a problem of engineering to be solved with overwhelming force and relentless, systematic pressure. And that brings up a really interesting question about that disastrous French attack. The plan was a massive gamble. They aimed to shatter the Ottoman army in a single, heroic charge, and it failed spectacularly. But looking back, was it an act of pure, arrogant folly, a bunch of glory hounds who didn't understand the war they were in? Or was it actually a stroke of genius that was just a hair's breadth away from working? A desperate, fatal gamble, yes, but maybe the only kind of move that could have broken the stalemate. It's a fine line between a brilliant plan and a reckless one. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you guys think about this one. Was it genius or was it madness? Let me know in the comments. The aftermath of the failed French sortie was like the silence after a lightning strike. The brief, crackling hope for a dramatic victory was gone, replaced by the grim, familiar rumble of the Ottoman war machine. But now, that machine was being driven by the cold, methodical hand of Fazil Ahmed Pasha Koprulu. And the final year of the siege would descend into a new layer of hell that made the previous 20 years look like a prelude. This was no longer a war of grand maneuvers or strategic gambles. The battlefield had shrunk to a few hundred yards of pulverized earth, shattered stone, and rotting corpses in front of the western bastions of Candia. The fighting became a desperate, intimate struggle for inches of ground. Koprulu's zigzagging approach trenches had done their job. The Ottoman front line was now, in many places, literally touching the base of what was left of the Venetian walls. The war had gone vertical, a struggle between men in trenches below and men on crumbling ramparts above, often separated by only a few feet of rubble. By the summer of 1669, the city of Candia itself was almost unrecognizable. The proud Renaissance architecture, the churches, the palazzos, all of it had been systematically pounded into rubble by 2 decades of non-stop bombardment. The streets were impassable canyons of debris. The civilian population had dwindled to a few thousand hardy souls, living like rats in cellars and makeshift shelters. The once mighty bastions, the pride of Venetian engineering, were no longer the clean, geometric shapes of the Trace Italian. They were crumbling, slumped mounds of earth and fractured stone, more like slag heaps than fortifications, and holding them was a skeleton crew of ghosts. Francesco Morosini, now in his early 50s, was still there. After more than 20 years of breathing gunpowder smoke and sleeping to the lullaby of cannon fire, he was a man running on pure, unadulterated willpower. His reports to Venice became increasingly stark. His force of effective soldiers had shrunk to just a few thousand. These were the survivors, the toughest, luckiest, or perhaps most cursed men in Europe. They were exhausted, malnourished, and riddled with disease, but they were also the most experienced siege fighters on the planet. They had to be. Koprulu's final strategy was one of pure brute force annihilation. His miners, now guided by an almost perfect understanding of the terrain, worked relentlessly. The number of mine and countermine detonations reached an insane, unbelievable crescendo. In the final months of the siege, historical accounts record that over 1,300 mines were detonated by both sides. Think about that. That's an average of more than a dozen underground explosions every single day. The very ground around Candia became a churning, unstable hellscape, constantly erupting in fountains of earth and shrapnel. The fighting in this final phase was raw and primitive. With the trenches so close, soldiers would simply lob primitive grenades, iron spheres packed with gunpowder and lit with a fuse, over the parapets into each other's positions. It was a constant, nerve-shredding exchange of small-scale explosions and vicious, close-quarters combat. The Ottomans would detonate a mine, create a small breach, and assault it. The Venetians would throw them back, and then the whole cycle would repeat a few hours later, a few yards down the line. It was a war fought with shovels and grenades in a landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon than a part of the world. And then came the final, fatal blow. It wasn't a cannonball or a mine, but an act of betrayal that gutted the very heart of the Venetian defense. The man at the center of it was a Venetian military engineer named Andrea Barozzi. The historical accounts are murky on the details. Some say he defected willingly, bribed by a massive sum of Ottoman gold. Others claim he was captured during a sortie and tortured into talking, but the result was the same. Barozzi knew everything. As one of the lead engineers, he had the keys to the kingdom. He possessed the complete, secret blueprints and schematics of Candia's entire subterranean defense network, the location of every listening gallery, every countermine tunnel, every secret passage. He handed this priceless intelligence over to Fazil Ahmed Pasha. For the Ottoman miners, it was like being given a perfect roadmap to victory. They now knew exactly where to dig to avoid detection. They knew where the Venetian listening posts were. They knew the weak points in the network. They could now bypass the Venetian counterminers entirely and place their massive explosive charges under the last remaining stable sections of the bastions with impunity. It was a catastrophic intelligence failure, the kind of betrayal that makes victory impossible. The soul of Candia's defense, its mastery of the underground, had been ripped out. While this hellish endgame was playing out in Crete, we need to shift our perspective back to the boardrooms of power, to the cool, marble halls of the Doge's palace in Venice. For 21 years, the Venetian Senate, the council of wealthy oligarchs who ran the Republic, had been funding this war. They had poured the modern equivalent of billions of dollars into the defense of Candia. They had emptied their treasury, melted down church silver, and gone deep into debt. Their lucrative Eastern trade, the very source of their wealth, had been crippled by the decades-long naval war with the Ottomans. Their other overseas colonies in the Aegean and along the Dalmatian coast were under constant threat. They were reading Francesco Morosini's dispatches, each one more desperate than the last. He was reporting that the St. Andrew Bastion was nothing but a pile of dirt. He had only 3,500 fighting men left to defend a perimeter that required 10 times that number. The city was, for all intents and purposes, indefensible. The end was no longer a question of if, but of when, and whether it would come in a week or a month. The senators faced a terrible, agonizing choice. On one hand, there was honor. For 21 years, Candia had been the symbol of Venetian resistance, of Christian defiance. To surrender it now would be a stain on the Republic's prestige. They could order Morosini to fight to the very last man, to turn the final fall of the city into a glorious, suicidal last stand that would be immortalized in songs and poems. A martyr's end. On the other hand, there was pragmatism, the quality that had made Venice rich and powerful in the first place. A fight to the last man would mean the loss of their last veteran soldiers, the destruction of their last cannons, and the enslavement or massacre of the thousands of remaining civilians. It would be a catastrophic loss of life and material for a cause that was already lost. A negotiated surrender, however humiliating, might save those thousands of lives. It might allow them to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage. After years of debate, the pragmatists finally won. In late August of 1669, a secret dispatch was sent to Francesco Morosini. The Venetian Senate authorized him to seek terms of surrender. With this heavy permission in his pocket, Morosini sent an envoy under a flag of truce to the Ottoman camp. The man he was to negotiate with was his great adversary, the man who had finally outmaneuvered him, the Grand Vizier Fazil Ahmed Pasha Koprulu. You have to imagine the scene. These two men, Morosini and Koprulu, were two of the most brilliant and determined commanders of their generation. For the past 3 years, they had been locked in a death struggle, trying to kill each other's men and outwit each other's plans every single day. Now, they were to meet as professionals to negotiate the end of it all. Koprulu could have been brutal. He held all the cards. His army was poised for the final, bloody assault that would have undoubtedly succeeded. He could have demanded unconditional surrender, but he was a pragmatist just like the Venetians. He knew that a final assault, even a successful one, would cost him thousands more of his elite janissaries. Why waste their lives to take a pile of rubble that was already his? He respected the sheer, bloody-minded tenacity of the Venetian defense. He had won, and he could afford to be magnanimous. He offered Morosini surprisingly, even shockingly, generous terms. The surrender was to be honorable. All surviving Venetian soldiers and foreign volunteers would be allowed to march out of the city with their personal weapons, their armor, and their regimental banners flying. Any civilian in Candia who wished to leave would be free to do so, taking all their transportable personal property with them. They would be given ships to evacuate to other Venetian-held islands. There would be no massacres, no enslavement. It was a respectful nod from one warrior to another, an acknowledgement of the epic struggle that had just taken place. Morosini, seeing no better alternative, accepted. On September 5, 1669, 21 years, 4 months, and 2 days after the Ottoman army first laid siege to the city, the surrender was formalized. A somber, skeletal procession of the surviving defenders marched out of the shattered gates of Candia. They were ghosts of men, walking skeletons in rusty armor, but they marched with their heads held high, their lion-emblazoned banners of St. Mark carried proudly. They boarded the waiting ships and sailed away, leaving the island of Crete behind forever. As the last Venetian ship cleared the harbor, the Ottoman standards with their golden crescent moon were raised over the ruins of the St. Andrew Bastion. The longest siege in history was finally over. Now for the reckoning. The butcher's bill for this 2-decade-long obsession was horrifying. On the Christian side, an estimated 30,000 soldiers and sailors had been killed. This includes the Venetians, the volunteers, the galley slaves, everyone. On the Ottoman side, the numbers are even more staggering. Conservative estimates put the number of Ottoman soldiers who died at Candia, from combat, from disease, from mining accidents, at over 100,000. Some estimates range much, much higher. The city of Candia, once a jewel of the Mediterranean, had been effectively erased from the map. It would take centuries to recover. For the Republic of Venice, the loss was a mortal blow. They had lost their most valuable, most strategic colony. They had bankrupted their state and sacrificed a generation of men to defend it. The fall of Candia marks the beginning of the end for Venice as a major European power. From this point on, it begins its long, slow, elegant decline into the museum city we know today. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a victory, but a Pyrrhic one. They had their prize. They had conquered Crete and removed the Venetian thorn from their side. But the cost had been astronomical. The immense drain on the Ottoman treasury and on its elite military manpower weakened the empire for decades to come. Some historians argue that the resources wasted at Candia were resources that could have been used to push deeper into Europe, perhaps changing the continent's history. But the legacy of the Siege of Candia goes far beyond the balance sheets of empires. It was a terrifying crucible, a laboratory where the science of war itself was forged and refined. The incredibly complex, three-dimensional war of mines and countermines, the systematic use of approach trenches, the duel between advanced artillery and advanced fortifications. All of these techniques were studied intently by military engineers across Europe. A young French engineer named Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, who would go on to become the foremost military engineer of his age, studied the events at Candia obsessively. The lessons learned in that bloody, 21-year struggle would directly influence the design of fortresses and the methods of siege warfare for the next 150 years, right up to the age of Napoleon. In the end, the Siege of Candia stands as a dark and awe-inspiring monument. It's a monument to the extremes of human endurance and cruelty, to the brutal, grinding logic of attritional warfare, and to the unbelievable, world-altering cost of a conflict born from a pirate's gamble and a mad sultan's rage. It remains the longest, and perhaps the most brutal single siege in the history of the world, a 21-year-long scream that marked the bloody transition from an old world of warfare to a new one. And that's where the story of the Siege of Candia comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.